Megan was one of the most charitable people I knew. She was always so giving of herself. She was a kindergarten teacher. She was the most amazing mother. She was my little sister. But I really looked up to her.
She was very loving, caring, and the last of my three.
A bit of a daddy's girl?
Yep. You know, we were close. It was a Saturday morning. We walked in, and when we got to the dining room, we saw her laying on the floor. I thought she had slipped and fell. Then we saw the blood, and I saw the gun kind of tucked against her leg.
I'm hollering, screaming, yelling at Steve to call 911. She was barely breathing.
I thought she had shot herself. I mean, I didn't see anybody else around. The next morning at 7:55, they pronounced her dead.
Pretty quickly, the police declared it a suicide, then the medical examiner declared it a suicide. What was your reaction?
No way. Something's not right.
I knew something was wrong with this case from the start. Well, I knew she hadn't killed herself. Had blood splat on top of it. Very important.
We were on the computer researching and learning about ballistics, about blood spatter.
Blood splatter.
The gun. I would expect if the barrel of a gun is up against someone's temple that there would be blood and hair on that barrel. And there is not.
Completely clean. Not even on the end of the barrel. No hair, no blood.
The state shut you down.
Oh, yeah.
Sheriff shut you down.
Right.
Coroner shut you down.
Right.
Thereby launches a years-long investigation spearheaded by your husband.
Absolutely.
He was our leader, and he kept us going. People thought we were just a grieving family. People thought he was just not able to move forward, and he just led us for 9 years, still leading us.
On a steamy summer morning in 2014, in the tiny southern town of Cottonport, Louisiana, Steve and Missy Ducote faced the unthinkable.
I wouldn't know how to tell you. I've never felt like that before or since.
The couple found their youngest daughter, Megan, lying on the floor of her living room.
I had no idea what was to become of all this.
The 29-year-old mother of two appeared to have been shot in the head.
It was a .357 Magnum gun with a .38 caliber bullet.
Just one day earlier, Megan's parents and her husband, then 30-year-old Dustin Parra, had been dealing with the aftermath of a car crash.
Dustin called and said that Megan had been in an accident.
Megan was alone, driving down this stretch of road not far from home, when she somehow careened off the road and hit a tree. Dustin grabbed their two young sons and rushed to the scene. So did Steve and Missy.
Cop said she was going about 45 miles an hour, wasn't on her phone, had her seatbelt on.
Megan had only minor injuries, but a state trooper was troubled by the fact that there were no skid marks.
He said that she had not applied the brakes.
Cop came and he asked me, would your daughter want to try to hurt herself? Well, I said, no, I don't think so.
But it was not clear whether Megan actually tried to stop the car. Missy says Megan told her she was distracted.
She said she had lost focus.
But Steve says Megan told him the brakes didn't work and that she hit that tree to avoid the bayou. However, the brakes were never tested. At the Avoyelles Parish Hospital, where Dustin worked as a nurse, Megan was treated for a cut to her right hand. Once released, Dustin took his wife home, while Missy and Steve kept their boys overnight. The next morning around 7 a.m., Megan sent her mother a text.
Hi, Mom. Are the boys okay? Are y'all okay? I called her and I told her that when the kids would get up and I had fixed breakfast, we would bring her breakfast and go check on her.
Anything sound unusual?
Not at all.
About an hour later, Missy says Dustin called her to say that Megan was going to take a bath while he went out to fill a prescription for her at the local Walmart.
He said he would pick up the kids on the way back. Well, an hour has passed by and he's still not here. And then I said, let's go. We need to go.
It was close to 10 a.m. when Steve and Missy arrived at their daughter's house with their grandchildren in tow. And there they discovered Megan laying on the floor with blood pooling around her head.
She was still in the paper shirt from the hospital and underwear.
I grabbed the oldest boy, and when I leaned over to pick him up, I saw the gun kind of tucked against her leg.
Missy called her parents to pick up the kids. Steve called 911. Missy, a nurse practitioner, knelt beside her daughter and realized she still had a pulse.
She was breathing, just barely though.
Steve called Dustin.
I can't remember exactly if I told him Megan killed herself or Megan shot herself. And I said, where are you? He said, I'm in Mansur. I just came through the four-way stop sign.
Dave Blanchard was the first officer on the scene.
I entered the house, saw the victim on the floor. Mrs. Ducote was administering first aid to the head area.
Dustin arrived about 10 minutes later.
He comes running in, and then he slides, and he just catches the end of the blood.
After he slid, he got up, he pushed the gun away.
Missy says Dustin then reached into a pocket in Megan's paper shirt.
And he pulled out a picture.
It was a picture of their boys. Dustin and Missy, both medically trained, worked to save Megan. Minutes later, paramedics arrived. That's when Officer Blanchard began documenting the scene.
I didn't want to interfere in them giving her first aid.
Megan was airlifted to a trauma center in Lafayette. The mayor of Cottonport drove Steve, Missy, and Dustin in his car. Back at the Parra home, Officer Blanchard continued to document the scene and collect evidence, including that gun, which belonged to Dustin, Dustin's shorts, which were bloodied from that slide, and this note, which was discovered on the kitchen counter.
It says, tell the boys I love them. I'm sorry. That was it.
The morning after the shooting, as her parents struggled with how Megan could have taken her own life, doctors told the family they had done all they could. That is when the decision was made to take her off life support. The next morning, Megan's organs were donated. Her body was transported to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. That's when Dustin and the Ducotes headed for the Cottonport Police Department to meet with lead detective Christopher Knight.
Well, Dustin went in first. He came back out and he raised his hand and said, I'm not a suspect. It was kind of shocking. Then Missy and I go in and, you know, Chris didn't ask us a whole lot. Wasn't much of an interview.
Steve and Missy say it was that day when they began to question everything about the investigation into their daughter's death, especially when Detective Knight handed Dustin that note, presumably left behind by Megan, and Dustin debated what to do with it.
He said, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I think I'm just going to throw it away. I said, no, don't throw it away. We might need it later on.
The very next day, Steve says Detective Knight showed up at his home. He had some news for him.
He says, Mr. Steve, Megan's fingerprints were all over the gun. Dustin's were too, but it's his gun.
Steve's brother-in-law, Luke Welsh, was there.
Steve repeated to him, so the only fingerprints on the gun were for Megan and Dustin. And he said, that's it. That's the only ones. End of story.
I said, well, she must have shot herself then.
But Steve would soon learn that what he says Detective Chris Knight told him was not true. The gun that killed Megan had not been tested at all.
That was a major turn in the story.
Yes, that's one of the major turns. This thing goes 360 degrees a lot.
Three weeks after Megan Parra's death, an autopsy report declared her cause of death to be a gunshot wound to the head. The manner of death was suicide. The report said Megan tested negative for sedatives and that the gun was in direct contact with her temple when it went off.
So much life to live and love to give.
Megan's uncle, Luke Welch, says the medical examiner confirmed Detective Chris Knight's theory that Megan had shot herself. Because remember, according to Knight, Megan's fingerprints were found all over that gun.
With that information coming from Chris, I think there's no doubt it's a suicide.
Detective Knight denies ever saying he tested that gun. And just 4 days after the shooting, he closed his investigation and summarized it in this one-page report.
According to the evidence collected, statements from family, and the doctor's report, this investigation shows Megan Parra did, in fact, commit suicide.
The only doctor's reports we had were Lafayette General.
Yeah, but Lafayette General was not doing any kind of forensic exam on her.
No.
Betsy, who was pregnant with her first child at the time, says Megan had been planning her baby shower.
2 days before she died, she asked me what color balloons I wanted.
Megan was also just months away from getting a master's degree. She had her eye on becoming a school principal. Steve says the more he thought about his daughter's death, the less it made sense.
Never shot a gun, never fooled with a gun. Wouldn't have known how to hold a gun.
He says there's also no way that Megan would have shot herself, knowing that he, Missy, and her boys would discover her that way.
She'd never do something like that.
But Megan was found behind locked doors. There was no evidence of forced entry. So if she didn't kill herself, who pulled the trigger?
Did you start to believe that Dustin shot her
Yes.
and tried to cover it up?
Yes.
There were questions about Dustin's alibi. Betsy says he told 3 different stories to 3 different people about where he was when Steve called him. But according to Megan's family, Detective Knight never resolved those conflicting stories.
There were so many things that were not done.
Knight also never followed up on reports that Dustin may have been having an affair.
Did Megan ever talk to you about trouble they were having in the marriage?
She didn't.
Did you ever ask her?
I didn't. And I feel like that's one of my biggest regrets.
Steve fears that in the days leading up to Megan's death, the couple may have been fighting. And something in the autopsy report haunted him.
It indicated she had some bruises in the abdomen and chest area.
What do you think happened that morning she was shot?
I think she was leaving him.
Steve says around the time he was becoming increasingly concerned about Detective Chris Knight's investigation, an investigator for the district attorney's office told him there was no way Detective Knight had fingerprinted that gun in just 2 days.
Steve. It takes me with a rush on it about 14 days. Then I knew.
Knew what?
Well, I knew she hadn't killed herself then.
But by then, the gun was no longer in evidence. With Detective Knight's permission, it had been returned to Dustin.
They gave him the gun back before the coroner ever ruled.
Steve says he begged local authorities to just hear him out, but no one would listen. Until 4 months later, when a local judge agreed to help.
Steve Ducote convinced the judge that there was something to look at.
Dan Schaub was commander of the Criminal Investigations Unit at the Avoyelles Parish Sheriff's Office. That judge asked Schaub himself to review the case.
First thing I did was, talk to Steve, see what his concerns were.
We started working on things, and boy, he was working.
Unfortunately, says Schaub, there wasn't much to work with.
Here, there was not even basic Detective 101 that was done by Chris Knight.
Schaub says his hands were also somewhat tied by Steve Ducote, who prevented him from accessing certain evidence, like Megan's cell phone.
At that point, Dustin had the cell phone, and he did not want to ask Dustin for her cell phone.
According to Steve, Dustin and the boys were living in Steve and Missy's house at the time, and he didn't want his son-in-law knowing they were investigating him. So Steve says he asked Schaub not to talk to Dustin until they had more evidence.
I wanted to be sure.
Why not at least call the husband? Not to go after him, but to say, hey, listen, just want to ask some questions so I can button some things up.
It's real easy. I did it out of respect for the Ducote family.
Rather than go against Steve Ducote, Schaub steered clear of Dustin Parra. Instead, he reviewed Chris Knight's one-page report, examined 115 photos taken by Officer Dave Blanchard, and he talked with 2 witnesses who had not been interviewed, neighbors, who each thought they heard what sounded like a gunshot that morning, but at 2 different times. The neighbor on the right told Schaub she heard a very loud boom a little after 7 a.m., but the neighbor on the left told Schaub he was certain he heard a gunshot about 2 hours later.
He was still in bed, and he wasn't sure of the time. He supposed around 9:15.
Schaub says the neighbor to the right wasn't sure if what she heard at 7 a.m. was actually a gunshot. So he created a timeline based on what the other neighbor reported hearing. Then the question became, could Dustin have even been home at 9:15 a.m.?
Dustin arrives at Walmart
Yes.
at 8:53 a.m.
A state trooper told Commander Schaub that he saw Dustin at an intersection not far from that Walmart just before 9 a.m. Chris Knight never had Walmart's surveillance footage subpoenaed to verify Dustin's alibi. But Schaub found the next best evidence, a time-stamped receipt.
Dustin signs for scripts at Walmart at 9:43 a.m.
Okay? Yeah.
So based on this timeline from you, there's no way Dustin could have been at the house when the shot was fired.
That's a reasonable conclusion, yes.
On January 15th, 2015, Dan Schaub released his 8-page report, also concluding that Megan died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Steve did not buy Dan Schaub's timeline, which he had based on the neighbor who reported hearing a gunshot around 9:15 a.m. But Schaub's report ended up being a gift. Steve Ducote now had those 115 photos taken the morning of Megan's shooting, and his investigation was about to ramp up.
This, caught everybody's attention.
Commander Dan Schaub's conclusion that Megan Parra likely shot herself was yet another blow to the Ducote family's theory that she may have been murdered by her husband, Dustin. But Schaub's report did provide some valuable clues, says Steve Ducote.
That report came with some blurred pictures.
So Steve tracked down the officer who took the photos, Dave Blanchard, and it turns out he still had the originals. He never deleted them from his camera.
Why did you save him?
Because there was evidence. I don't know, it stuck out, suspicious.
He thought that there were some things that weren't resolved in the investigation.
Blanchard gave the digital images to the Avoyelles Parish District Attorney, Charles Riddle, and Riddle shared them with an insistent Steve.
I said, I'm not leaving without those pictures.
Did you go through all the photos?
Yes.
Steve and his daughter Betsy began studying those 115 photos from the day Megan was shot.
And I've had a lot of people ask me, how could you look at those crime scene photos of your sister?
Yeah.
And I'd say, she'd have done it for me.
Betsy says she also spent hours on the internet studying blood spatter patterns because something about the blood around Megan just didn't look right to her.
You can see the blood spatter where it should have been on the exit wound side. It's actually on the entrance wound side. And there's no spatter on the exit wound.
There's always more exit wound blood than entry wound blood.
Steve was beginning to believe that his daughter had been rolled over after she was shot. Also troubling to him was that seemingly clean gun, Dustin's gun.
People all said blood should have been all the way up here.
To Steve, it appeared that the gun had been wiped clean. Then there was that picture of Megan's boys that Dustin discovered in her pocket. Steve believes it was Dustin who put it there in the first place.
If you're gonna make it look like suicide, you're gonna do things like that.
Steve also thinks Dustin planted the alleged suicide note and firmly believes it was not even written by his daughter.
She never wrote in solid print. She write mixed print, script in the same word.
Some of the photos revealed clues of a struggle, says Steve, like this wine rack found behind a chair and this guitar lying on the floor.
I think they were fighting.
Several months later, Steve Ducote circled back to District Attorney Riddle and showed him some of the photos that concerned him.
And as I looked at it, I kept saying, this can't be what was found to be a suicide.
Riddle says he tried to get the sheriff's department to take another look at the case, but they refused.
The local police department really didn't have the capacity, so we tried to get state police to look into it, and they didn't seem to be interested.
So Riddle went to then Avoyelles Parish coroner, Dr. L.J. Mayu, who had issued Megan's death certificate. Based on the medical examiner's report, Mayu had classified Megan's death a suicide. Riddle tried to get him to change it to undetermined.
Why did you want that?
So that we could open up an investigation. And we started showing him some of the photos, and he said, hey, I'm convinced that it ought to be reopened.
Dr. Mayu reviewed Detective Chris Knight's one-page report.
What do you know about Chris Knight's investigation of this death?
Sloppy and very questionable.
Mayu says he found out that Chris Knight had not even attended Megan's autopsy. But the former coroner admits that his office also didn't conduct much of an investigation.
Did you ever interview the husband?
No, sir.
Why not?
We couldn't find him.
Did you try calling him?
Yes. No answer.
In 2017, District Attorney Charles Riddle sent this letter, written by Dr. Mayu, to the Louisiana State Police, requesting a review of the case. In the letter, Mayu wrote, I was informed that there were photographs which I had not seen, and many questions are unanswered. The state police did agree to look at the case.
What came of that?
The state police found no evidence to overturn the initial findings.
By now, Dustin had moved on. He married his second wife, and they were raising Megan's sons.
Right there, that little space.
But Steve Ducote could not move on.
Right there.
And he called an old high school buddy for help. David Lemoyne, a highly respected FBI agent who was now retired and living in Nebraska.
What'd you tell him?
I said, I need some help. I need to find out who did it.
In 2018, more than 4 years after Megan was shot, David Lemoyne flew to Cottonport to spend time with his brother, Peter Lemoyne, and to take a meeting with Steve Ducote. Steve asked his old friend to review a binder filled with photographs and documents, says Peter Lemoyne.
He came to my house that night, spent hours and hours just sifting through the evidence. And by the next morning, he went to Steve's house and said, "Your daughter was murdered."
What do you make of the family's determination to get answers? See more evidence from the case at 48hours.com.
But I'd always tell Steve, as long as my brother is in this case, you're gonna be okay.
Peter Lemoyne remembers the day in 2019 when his brother, former FBI agent David Lemoyne, came out of retirement, determined to help Steve Ducote get to the bottom of his daughter Megan's death.
Once David Lemoyne knew that that girl was killed, nothing was gonna stop him.
He was fired up when he called me.
Zach Shelton got a call from his friend and fellow retired FBI agent asking for help.
And when I reviewed the file, there was something there. There was no doubt in my mind that we were headed in the right direction.
I had no help, very little help. Then I had the best I could ever get.
But to dig into the case, the former FBI agents needed new badges. So they turned to one of the only local law enforcement officials willing to help.
So it's great to see you.
At the time, Ernest Anderson was Cottonport's police chief. He agreed to reopen the case and to deputize David Lemoyne and Zach Shelton.
And he swore us in as Cottonport police officers, and that gave us the authority to look into it.
Then Assistant Police Chief Justin Chenevert asked to be assigned to the case. He strapped on his body cam and helped two seasoned investigators interview witnesses.
All right, go ahead, state your name. Christopher White.
On January 15th, 2019, the original detective on the case agreed to talk. By then, a police officer in a neighboring town. Chris Knight said that on the day of the shooting, he felt overwhelmed and called for backup. Among others, Chad Janson, a well-known detective and blood spatter expert, showed up. And Knight says Janson told him it was clear. Megan had shot herself.
The way the body was positioned and the blood splatter in the gun, that it actually was suicide.
But on a recorded interview,
Okay, we're on the record.
Janson disputed Knight's account.
What Detective Knight basically wanted to know was, could I determine if this was a suicide or not? I said, no, it's not that simple.
Janson says he told Detective Knight that the scene was badly contaminated, and he advised Knight to investigate closely until he could rule out homicide. But Knight admits he never sent the gun out for testing.
Why not? I have no idea.
And said he had never fully examined the evidence.
Because I looked at it as a suicide and not a homicide. If I botched this, then I'll take the butt, my fault, But was it done on purpose? Absolutely not.
Chris Knight repeatedly refused our request for an interview, but did send this written statement, which reads in part, "I was a young, inexperienced investigator, and would I do some things differently today? With the training and experience I now have, absolutely." Zach and David were now working hard to do better, and did something Knight never had.
Go ahead and state your name for me, Dustin Parra.
They questioned Dustin Parra extensively for more than an hour.
Was there any arguing going on, any fighting going on?
Not anything that a normal married couple would go through.
Dustin said that in the weeks leading up to her death, his wife had seemed depressed and obsessed with the question of where young children go when they die.
In the middle of the night, she'd come wake me up. I can't stop thinking that my kids wouldn't go to heaven if something happened to them.
Dustin's the only one who said that. She never mentioned it to anybody.
What never made sense to me is if he thought she was going to commit suicide, there was no way he would have left his wife alone to go to Walmart.
And what about those rumors of infidelity?
Did you have affairs?
Yes.
Did she know about it?
To my knowledge, no, because she'd have questioned me.
Also troubling to David and Zach was the way Steve Ducote described Dustin sliding into Megan's blood.
He came running in from the garage door. He gets in a baseball slide position and he slides.
I slipped in a pool of blood at around her head.
Dustin said it was an accident, but Zach Shelton did not buy that.
But what better thing to slide in right there in the blood and disrupt the crime scene?
Dustin was also asked about the alleged suicide note, which David and Zach were now convinced had been planted by Dustin himself.
Somebody planted this note after she died. Who could that have been?
I really don't know.
Dustin repeatedly denied having anything to do with Megan's death or any sort of cover-up.
I feel like don't try to incriminate me.
You need to come clean, and you need to say we got in a fight, and maybe she grabbed the gun first.
Maybe she shot herself in front of you. I don't know, but you were there.
When she was shot, I was not there.
David Lemoyne pushed so hard that Dustin abruptly ended the interview.
I'm done, guys.
In that moment, I'm thinking he's definitely involved. See, this is early on.
Zach and David also interviewed Ann Guillory, the neighbor who thought she may have heard a gunshot early that morning.
A little after 7 a.m., I heard a boom, a loud boom.
And you clearly heard it.
Oh, yes, it was very loud. So I said to myself, oh my gosh, that was a loud noise.
We also have a guy on the left side that said he had heard a gunshot around 9:20, but he wasn't sure if it was a gunshot.
Zach Shelton and David Lemoyne were convinced that Ann Guillory, the neighbor to the right, heard the shot that killed Megan a little after 7 a.m., leaving Dustin plenty of time to shoot his wife and cover up his crime, then drive to Walmart. But their case was purely circumstantial, until a forensic expert hired by Steve Ducote discovered what he believes to be the physical evidence connecting Dustin to the shooting.
Puts him there when my daughter was shot.
It was now 2020, and Zach Shelton and David Lemoyne were feeling confident about the case they were building against Dustin Parra. Then, says Peter Lemoyne, as COVID hit the U.S., the deadly virus killed Peter's brother David on December 28th, 2020.
I made up my mind at that very time that I was going to finish what he started.
Mr. Peter just literally picked up where Mr. David left off.
Just like that, okay?
Zach Shelton and Steve Ducote now had a new partner, a highly respected local attorney.
Went to work on it as hard as any human could have worked on it, you know.
Peter says his main job was to keep their case in front of District Attorney Charles Riddle.
In an effort to make sure that he was aggressively prosecuted. What he told me was, we need more.
So Steve Ducote asked the Jefferson Parish Crime Lab to examine the evidence and check for suspicious blood spatter on Dustin's clothing. The lab found no evidence of murder or any evidence Dustin was there when the gun went off. But Steve was still convinced that Dustin had shot Megan and had purposely slid into her blood to cover up any incriminating spatter. So, in April of 2021, Steve hired an independent crime scene analyst named Eric Richardson.
Can you show me the blood spatter?
Yeah. Okay. So when you look close, you see these very, very small misting pattern right here. All that.
Richardson examined photos of the shorts worn by Dustin Parra, and he honed in on a fine mist of blood right under this pocket flap. It's a pattern he says can only be caused by high-velocity blood spatter from a gunshot wound.
It told me that Dustin was there when that gun was discharged into Megan's head.
You sure?
positive?
It was concrete evidence.
We proved he was in the room next to her. We know that it was his gun.
The only explanation is that he killed her.
Eric Richardson also agreed that the gun looked like it had been wiped clean. On October 13th, 2021, Charles Riddle took the case to a grand jury.
6 minutes after you present it to the grand jury, they come back with a charge of
second-degree murder.
Dustin was arrested, pleaded not guilty, and was released on bond. Based on the blood spatter that Richardson found on Dustin's shorts and the charges, the medical examiner revised Megan's autopsy report and changed the manner of death from suicide to undetermined. Charlie Riddle prepared for a now nearly 9-year-old case to go to trial.
We believe she was shot about 7:30.
You think he left her there while she was still alive?
Oh, I know he did. Yeah.
But it was not an open and shut case, says Riddle. He says experts from the state police and the Jefferson Parish crime labs were going to be called by the defense and told him they would be testifying that the blood spatter on Dustin's shorts did not prove he was present when the gun went off. And then there was Megan's note to her sons. A handwriting expert hired by Steve Ducote was going to testify that it was most likely written by Megan. But Charlie Riddle says he was prepared to argue that it was not a suicide note.
I thought that she was just leaving him.
There was also the difficulty of proving what time Megan was shot, where Dustin was when it happened, and how long Megan could have been lying on the floor before Steve and Missy discovered her still alive.
You know the damage it did to her brain, right?
Oh, God, yes. I'm surprised she was still alive, yes.
What could you see the defense making hay of successfully?
They were gonna make hay over the accident the night before. They were gonna say that she tried to commit suicide the night before.
On Friday, March 24th, 2023, just 3 days before Dustin Parra's murder trial was set to begin, Charlie Riddle says his phone rang.
I get a call from the defense attorney. He said, well, I want to offer a plea, negligent homicide.
Negligent homicide in the state of Louisiana is not defined as a crime of violence and only carries a sentence of up to 5 years.
David, it was an awful deal. If all you're going to get is negligent homicide, you're not risking much at all by going to trial.
I was concerned that he could walk away a free man, never clear her name for those boys, and they never know the truth.
The Ducotes said they would agree to a deal, but only if Dustin answered some very specific questions. On March 26, 2023, Dustin Parra pleaded nolo contendere, or no contest, to negligent homicide. And Charlie Riddle got to question him on the stand. Riddle read to us from the record.
Your marriage to her was a struggle for the last couple of months of her life, correct? Answered by Parra, yes, sir. On the morning of June 28, 2014, you and her were arguing and she threatened to leave, correct? Parra, yes. I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea. You had a pistol in your hand, and in the struggle, the gun went off, firing into her head, correct? Answer, yes. I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea. We wanted to make sure that he admitted that he shot her and it was not suicide.
To us, as a family, him admitting to that was huge.
But y'all weren't done. What was the last and next thing you wanted to do?
Get those boys.
Dustin had full custody of his and Megan's sons, and he'd had it for nearly 9 years. They lived with him and his new wife.
You wanted full custody?
Full custody.
Stripping him of his rights?
Full custody.
And you got it?
And we got it.
On April 20th, 2023, Missy and Steve Ducote were granted full custody. 7 days later, we were there when Dustin and his wife arrived at the sheriff's department so that Dustin could turn himself in.
Dustin, we tried to reach you. I wanted to get your side. I wanted to hear from you. People are going to watch this and they see your silence. Silence is all you're leaving us with.
Dustin never said a word.
I do wonder what you think Megan would say to you at the conclusion of all of this, if she could.
She'd say, take care of those boys. And probably say, thanks for not giving up.
God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be satisfied. Am I satisfied? If I know Meg's okay up there, alongside Jesus and all the angels, but in my heart, she'll be forever 29.
Need more time with 48 Hours? Go deep behind every true crime episode with first-hand accounts from 48 Hours Investigations.
Were you at all prepared for what happened in this case?
Shock is the word that comes to mind.
Get inside the twists and turns and get in on the case. Listen to Post-mortem from 48 Hours, now available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Anne-Marie Green, and we are back for another episode of 48 Hours Post-mortem. And I'm joined today with CBS News national correspondent David Begnaud and producer Judy Rybak to discuss the suspicious death of Megan Parra. David, Judy, thanks for joining me.
You bet.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be here with you, Anne-Marie. This is a case that took so many twists and turns over several years. In 2014, Megan Parra was found on her living room floor by her parents. She was unresponsive from a gunshot wound to the head. When she later died at the hospital, the manner of her death was questioned by her family. Was it suicide, as police said, or was it a homicide? Before we get into postmortem, though, let's remind listeners what this case was all about.
On June 28, 2014, in the small town of Cottonport, Louisiana, Missy and Steve Ducote faced the unthinkable when they discovered their daughter Megan Parra in her own home with a gunshot wound to the head.
I wouldn't know how to tell you. I've never felt like that before or since.
Missy, a nurse practitioner, tried to revive her daughter.
She was breathing, just barely though.
Megan's husband, Dustin, showed up minutes later, slipped in his wife's blood, and also tried to save Megan. But it was too late. She was taken off of life support the next day. Her death was ruled a suicide, but Steve Ducote was convinced there was foul play.
I knew something was wrong with this case from the start. Well, I knew she hadn't killed herself.
He eventually got his hands on more than 100 images taken at the shooting scene. Some of the photos revealed signs of a struggle, says Ducote, like this wine rack found behind a chair. Megan's sister, Betsy Janson, says the blood spatter patterns just didn't look right to them.
We were on the computer researching and learning about ballistics, about blood spatter.
Steve Ducote says they kept finding more and more evidence they believe proved Megan was murdered, but no one would listen.
The state shut you down.
Oh, yeah.
Sheriff shut you down.
Right.
Until a crime scene analyst discovered what he believed to be irrefutable physical evidence on the shorts Dustin was wearing that day. Evidence that the Avoyelles Parish District Attorney Charlie Riddle presented to a grand jury on October 13th, 2021. 6 minutes after you presented to the grand jury, they come back with a charge of
second-degree murder.
But it was not an open and shut case, says Riddle.
People thought we were just a grieving family, and he just led us for 9 years, still leading us.
So, David, you are originally from Louisiana. What was your impression of Steve's persistence and determination to re-examine his daughter's death and how that speaks to the culture of Louisiana?
For me, it was classic Louisiana, right? People from the area where I grew up, and Steve grew up about an hour away from me, they are a persistent, genuine, relentless group of people. When they feel passionate about something, we're very welcoming, but we are very insistent when we see an injustice. And here is a man who literally was on his own island. Nobody seemed to believe him. Nobody was basically backing him. And he quietly, and for the most part politely, persisted for years when folks in town and people in power didn't believe him.
What do you think was sort of at the heart of why he insisted on getting this case re-examined? What was justice he was looking for?
He did not want those boys, Megan's 2 sons and his grandchildren, to believe and go forward with their lives thinking that their mother took her own life. He just was not going to accept that.
Understandable. So, Judy, what initially hooked you when you heard about this case?
So I was sitting at home one night and I got a call from David. You're not going to believe it. I just got a call from a guy I used to know in Louisiana and, you know, I'm going to send you this video, take a look at it, and then let's talk. David, tell them about the video, please.
Well, the video, they have these 2 retired FBI agents who, when you sit there and you watch them talk and you watch the interrogations they did, I mean, I'm telling you, if... You know, it's proof that we live in a world today where you can watch a video and you're like ready to render a verdict. And, you know, I was ready to render a verdict of, we got to go look into this story. And I think what I'm fulfilled by in this hour is I think Judy and the editors did a masterful job in telling a story that does not tip the scale, that presents the facts and allows people to come away at the end forming their own opinion.
See, I think that's really interesting that people need to know that often when you're covering these cases, obviously there are families on both sides of a case that appeal to you to win you over. But it's up to 48 hours to really ask the tough questions, you know, not just of the police, not just of the accused, but also of the grieving family members of the victims.
And that's difficult for the family a lot of times, because imagine the worst moment in your life now being in the hands of strangers you just met to put together for an hour in prime time. I mean, you'd be a little concerned too, right?
Right. So listen, at the heart of this case is the investigation, both the one conducted by authorities and also the one conducted by Megan's family. So we're going to start with the lead detective, Chris Knight's investigation. David or Judy, what stood out to you about the investigation that he conducted?
So if you ask any investigator, they'll tell you that even if it looks like a suicide, you have to investigate until you rule out homicide. That was not done, you know, and then the family told us that Detective Chris Knight said he found Megan's fingerprints on the gun. And they were like, well, you know, I guess she shot herself because why else would her fingerprints be on the gun? And then what set Steve Ducote into investigating this case was that he later found out that the gun hadn't been tested at all, that Chris Knight had allegedly lied to him. That definitely stood out to us. You have to remember that when they found Megan, she was still alive. Had she been dead when she was found, this whole investigation would have gone differently. They would have had more pictures of her the way she was found, and they also probably would have tested her hands for gunshot residue. But the fact that she was alive, was taken to the hospital, they worked on trying to save her life, and then her organs were harvested. By the time she got to the medical examiner, her hands were bagged, but at that point, what kind of gunshot residue would they have found on her hands? But Chad Johnson, who was a local detective in town, Detective Knight asked him to come over and look at the scene, and Johnson told us over the phone that he told Knight, you know, the scene was really badly contaminated and that he had to do a very good job of investigating this to figure out what had happened.
But instead, Chris Knight's investigation was minimal. And I want to remind listeners, too, that Chris denies that he told the family the gun had been fingerprinted. Right.
Anne-Marie, this case is so wild in terms of how this investigator handled it. It came down to a one-page report. I mean, the guy basically suggested to the medical examiner, because she told us this, that he felt it was a suicide and kind of was a done deal before she even really started working heavily on the case.
A really messy initial investigation. So then 4.5 years later, Detective Knight is questioned by former FBI agents Zach Shelton and David Lemoyne, who were able to officially investigate after being deputized by the Cottonport Police Department. As we mentioned before, according to Knight, on the day of the shooting, detective and blood spatter expert Chad Jean-Sean showed up to the scene, told Knight that it was clear to him that Megan had shot herself, and that's why Knight says he didn't investigate further. Here's a clip of Chris Knight in that interrogation.
The way the body was positioned and the blood splatter in the gun, that it actually was a suicide.
But on a recorded interview,
Okay, we're on the record.
Janson disputed Knight's account.
What Detective Knight basically wanted to know was, could I determine if this was a suicide or not? I said, no, it's not that simple.
Janson says he told Detective Knight that the scene was badly contaminated, and he advised Knight to investigate closely until he could rule out homicide. But Knight admits he never even sent the gun out for testing.
Why not? I have no idea.
And said he had never fully examined the evidence.
Because I looked at it as a suicide and not a homicide. If I botched this, then I'll take the butt, my fault, But was it done on purpose? Absolutely not.
From your extensive, experience reporting on crime duty, what do you think of Knight's explanation? Oh, my goodness. We've had so many conversations about this. I think he was young and inexperienced, and I think, she was found behind locked doors by herself. I think to him, it just looked like a suicide. I just don't think he thought that it was murder. We'll never know.
And he is just admitting to everything. Like, yeah, I didn't do that. Yeah, I don't know why I didn't send the gun off for testing. I don't know why I didn't do this. I don't know why. I mean, it is maddening. And by the way, we did everything but beg him to sit down for an interview. And he just didn't want to talk. He did not want to do anything in front of the camera. He sent us a written statement that's included in the piece.
Here's a clip from the broadcast.
Chris Knight repeatedly refused our request for an interview, but did send this written statement, which reads in part, "I was a young, inexperienced investigator. And would I do some things differently today? With the training and experience I now have, absolutely."
I think the other problem was the accident the night before the shooting. Chris Knight was actually at the scene of the accident. And I think he thought, she tried to kill herself last night and now she succeeded. So that may have also played into the way that he behaved. Right. And what's interesting about the medical examiner's determination here with Megan's death is the medical examiner determined that it was a suicide as well. And when a lot of people think of, a medical examiner, you think this is a doctor, we're talking about science, an authority figure, but really so much of their own investigation is informed by the evidence that they're given by police. Police often sort of give them kind of a framework. They set the scene, and then the medical examiners look at the science and kind of use a combination of both to come to a conclusion.
Okay, so you're bringing up something that's so important here. In this case, the medical examiner said to us, Chris Knight called her before she even cut into Megan's body and basically gave her a rough estimate that he thought it was probably a suicide because this and this. She then proceeds with that thinking into the autopsy, finds a little bit of bruising, by the way, that is kind of questionable enough to write it on the report. And where could that old bruising come from? In the abdomen area, right? But then she issues a finding of suicide. And Anne-Marie, what's so important about what you're bringing up is that then is a determination that all the officials in town start saying, well, the doctor said it was a suicide. So then Steve Ducote, the father, is trying to undo that because that is a classification. What then becomes even more fascinating about this story is the unwinding. This medical examiner went from suicide to undetermined to homicide. And I think, Judy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she said this is the first time in her career she's ever walked it back that far and gone from suicide to homicide. First time the district attorney says he's ever saw that. First time I've ever seen that in my career, that it's been walked back that far.
Yeah, for sure. That's what she told us on the phone that night.
You've interacted with a lot of medical examiners, especially in these, small towns, large counties. They work hard, Judy.
They do work hard, and they're overworked. They have too many cases, and there's, sort of a rush on everything. And I think that might have been at play here as well.
But of course, the investigation and the examiner's report just didn't sit right with Megan's family, especially her father, Steve. So when we get back from the break, we're going to get into his relentless fight for justice and what finally cracked this case wide open. Stay tuned. So months after Megan's death is ruled a suicide, her family still won't accept that this is how she died, especially her father, Steve. Steve keeps hounding local authorities until a judge decides that the case should be re-examined. And the judge asks Dan Schaub, the commander of the Criminal Investigations Unit at Avoyelles Parish Sheriff's Department, to look into this. And let's listen to what Schaub said in the broadcast.
First thing I did was, talk to Steve, see what his concerns were.
We started working on things. Boy, he was working.
Unfortunately, says Schaub, there wasn't much to work with.
Here, there was not even basic Detective 101 that was done by Chris Knight.
Schaub says his hands were somewhat tied by Steve Ducote, who he says prevented him from accessing certain evidence like Megan's cell phone.
At that point, Dustin had the cell phone, and he did not want to ask Dustin for her cell phone.
Okay, so this is, struck me as odd. Steve is pushing. He is fighting hard. He wants a new investigation, but then he starts to pull back when it comes to the cell phone information. What was that about?
Dustin and the boys were living with Steve and Missy at that point, and I think Steve was just nervous. He was nervous for his son-in-law to find out that he was having him investigated. So he wanted Dan Schaub to do as much as he could without speaking to Dustin.
Let's discuss more of the evidence. The family eventually obtains 115 photographs from the initial investigation of the crime scene, and then they begin analyzing the photographs. And I want to talk about the blood spatter evidence. David or Judy, what did you to make of this evidence?
Yeah, so initially that was one of the things that was outstanding to us. If you shoot yourself, the bullet goes right through your head. Most of the blood spatter you would think would be on the exit wound side, right? It seemed like there was more blood spatter on the entrance wound side where she shot herself. But, two things about that. Experts have told us that you can't rely on that there can sometimes be more blood spatter on the entrance wound side. But also when you look at the photographs, no photographs were taken of her left side where the exit wound was. So you can't really tell if there was more on the entrance wound side because you can't see the exit wound side. Also, there was some question about the bullet. The bullet was found in the room to the left side of her. So in order to believe that she was shot the other way, the bullet would have had to bounce off several walls to end up where they found it. Also, Dustin slid in the blood, right? So we don't know how much of that spatter comes from the slide. We just don't know. There just isn't enough information about the blood spatter.
I just wanted to talk about the gun. When you look at this gun, there is like a needle print of blood inside on the top portion of the gun that appears to some as if the gun was wiped clean and the what was used to wipe it just couldn't get that little needle point that sort of burrowed in the gun. That was always interesting to me.
But also remember, there's no photographs down the barrel of the gun, and there's no photographs of the other side of the gun. So you're only getting a partial view of the gun. I agree that it looks like wiped clean as a whistle. But
we're limited by what we can actually see.
Right. And then the gun disappears, And this is another thing we didn't get to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Tell them where the gun went.
So according to Steve Ducote, the gun is given back to Dustin, and a relative of Steve's buys the gun from Dustin and then throws it in the river.
In Toledo Bend, which is a very popular sort of vacation spot where some people have second homes. And, I'd say it's about 2 hours from where this death happened.
I mean, the truth is, by the time this relative bought it, it was irrelevant anyway, right? I mean, what are you going to get off of it at that point? But they just felt it was so hurtful to have that gun in existence that they threw it in the river.
But of course, Anne-Marie, if you're an investigative reporter like us, we're like, now why you need to throw it at the bottom of a lake? Like, I got some questions, right?
This case really starts gaining more momentum in 2018 when Steve brings it to his friend from high school, David Lemoyne, who just happens to be a retired FBI agent. And then David comes out of retirement and he enlists a fellow retired FBI agent, Zach Shelton, to help. And they did something that Detective Knight never did the first time around. They questioned Dustin extensively for an hour. Let's play some of that conversation.
I feel like y'all trying to incriminate me. You need to come clean, and you need to say we got in a fight, and maybe she grabbed the gun first.
Maybe she shot herself in front of me. I don't know, but you were there.
When she was shot, I was not there.
David Lemoyne pushed so hard that Dustin abruptly ended the interview.
All right, I'm done, guys.
In that moment, I'm thinking he's definitely involved.
So when you heard the interrogation, and I'm sure you listened to much more than just that little snippet that we played, what did you think about Dustin's demeanor? What did you think about their approach?
I thought they were respectful, honestly. And quite frankly, I thought Dustin was candid. He looked comfortable. He seemed agreeable to being there. He didn't seem agitated. He didn't seem unhappy. And then it got a little testy. And then it got real testy. And Dustin got up and left.
And so what ends up happening is Dustin is charged with Megan's murder. 3 days before the trial, though, is scheduled to begin, his defense team offers a plea deal of negligent homicide. And Megan's family agrees to it. Dustin pleads nolo contendere, which basically means no contest. District Attorney Charles Riddle got to question Parra on the stand. And here's a clip of him reading the record.
Your marriage to her was a struggle for the last couple of months of her life, correct? Answered by Parra, yes, sir. On the morning of June 28, 2014, you and her were arguing and she threatened to leave, correct? Parra, yes. I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea. You had a pistol in your hand, and in the struggle, the gun went off, firing into her head, correct? Answer, yes, I'm not contesting as part of the nolo contendere plea. We wanted to make sure that he admitted that he shot her and it was not suicide.
To us, as a family, him admitting to that was huge.
A negligent homicide charge only carries a maximum sentence of 5 years. Dustin will likely only spend 18 months behind bars and the rest on parole. Why did the family accept this deal?
They weren't trying to lock Dustin away forever. It was clear to Judy and I all along that what was most important was getting those boys to understand their mother didn't do it. And now, in a court of law, in their father's own words, they have it. And what was second most important was getting custody of those boys. Because what Steve and Missy did not want was for those boys to be living with their stepmother while their father was in prison. And so here's what's interesting to note. In Steve and Missy getting the boys, they don't just have them temporarily until Dustin gets out. Dustin has lost custody. His rights were terminated. And in order to get them back, he has to go to a court and petition a judge and make the argument. That is an uphill battle.
Jeez. Listen, let's talk about when you do sit down across from him, David. He refused to speak to you. And then When Dustin arrived at the sheriff's department to turn himself in, you approach him and ask him for his side of the story. But he still will not say a word. I have to say, it was perhaps the most polite confrontation I have seen, David. Your Southern charm was, showing itself in full force. But you couldn't get anything out of him. What was your impression of him during that meeting?
Not once did he have a look of anger or wanting to yell at me. I mean, his eyes were soft. His facial expressions were restful. And he just sat there. And what I am fascinated by is how someone who has faced an avalanche of criticism and suspicion and then takes a plea deal and is now going to jail is still mouth shut.
I think that Dustin was afraid he was going to end up in prison for the rest of his life. And he took this deal because I think he thought he would do 1.5 years in prison and then go on with his life. And he just wanted us and everybody to go away.
Megan's parents got what they really wanted, which was to be awarded full custody of Megan and Dustin's 2 sons. Now, at the time of the shooting, those boys were just 18 months and 4 years old. They're now 11 and 13. What sort of impact has this had on them?
Yeah, it's been really tough. It's been really tough. But we are told that things are getting better.
I mean, you have to remember that they were living with their dad for 9 years while their grandfather was investigating their father.
And hearing only what their dad wanted them to know.
Right. At some point, Missy told us that they basically stopped talking to their grandparents. I think these cases are particularly difficult on the families of the victims. This is my 4th case in a row where the question was it suicide or murder? And I've noticed that these cases are really more difficult on the families than a murder case because there is no full closure. When someone has been murdered, there's a villain, there's somebody you can focus your attention on. But when you're fighting to prove that your loved one didn't take their own life, there's a lot of emotion around that you don't see in other cases.
I can totally see that, Judy. The guilt that family members would have. Why didn't I see something? Why didn't I say something? Why didn't they reach out to me? That you might not have with a random murder. I want to thank you guys, both David and Judy, for joining me for this. This has been a great conversation.
Pleasure.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
So join us next Tuesday for another post-mortem and watch 48 Hours, Saturdays, 10/9 Central on CBS and streaming on Paramount+. And if you're liking the show, please rate and review 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts and follow 48 Hours wherever you get your podcasts. You can also listen ad-free on the Amazon Music and Wondery app or with a 48 Hours Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts.